The resume on the mahogany desk was thin printed on cheap paper, but the name at the top was heavy enough to crack the glass surface. Michael didn't need to read the qualifications. He knew exactly how she handled pressure, how she charmed investors, and how she could dismantle a man's life with a single signature. The intercom buzzed, slicing through the silence of his 42nd floor office. "Mr. Sullivan, the 3 p.m. candidate is here. She says she knows you." Michael swiveled his chair toward the panoramic view of a gray, snowy Chicago. "Send her in." If stories about the complex, shadowy corridors of human relationships and the price of redemption speak to you, stay with me. The heating system in the Sullivan Tower was state-of-the-art, designed to keep the temperature at a constant, comfortable 72 degrees. Yet Michael Sullivan felt a chill settle into the marrow of his bones. He stared at the single sheet of paper on his desk. It was a standard resume template, the kind you could download for free from the internet. The font was Times New Roman, uninspired and safe. But the name printed in bold at the top was a ghost story. Kendall Martin, not Kendall Sullivan. She had reverted to her maiden name. A small mercy, or perhaps a legal necessity, after the divorce papers had been signed in absentia 5 years ago. "Sir," the voice of his assistant Jessica crackled through the intercom, tentative and soft. "The 3 o'clock is waiting. Should I tell her to leave? I can tell her the position has been filled." Michael looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows. Chicago lay beneath him, a grid of iron and snow gray under the February sky. 5 years ago, he had stood in an office half this size watching movers repossess his furniture, listening to the dial tone of a phone that had been disconnected for non-payment. He had been bankrupt, humiliated, and entirely alone. Now he owned the skyline, and she was in his lobby. "No," Michael said, his voice dropping an octave, turning into the gravelly baritone that made subcontractors nervous. "Send her in." He didn't stand up when the heavy oak door opened. He didn't adjust his tie or check his reflection. He sat perfectly still, his hands clasped on the leather blotter, waiting. The woman who walked in was a stranger. The Kendall he remembered was vibrant, a creature of silk and gold, who walked with the entitlement of a queen. This woman was thinner, her cheekbones sharp enough to cut. She wore a charcoal suit that was well-tailored, but clearly old, seasoned wool that had seen too many dry cleanings. Her blonde hair, once a cascading halo, was pulled back into a severe utilitarian bun. She took 3 steps into the room and stopped. Her eyes, the color of Lake Michigan in winter, met his. For a second, he saw the panic flare behind her iris, a terrified animal caught in the headlights of a semi-truck. "Hello, Michael," she said. Her voice was raspy, stripped of its musical lilt. "Ms. Martin," Michael replied. He didn't gesture for her to sit. He let the silence stretch heavy and suffocating, filling the space between them. "You're applying for the junior administrative assistant position." Kendall swallowed hard. "Yes. The job pays $45,000 a year. No benefits for the first 6 months. You'll be reporting to Jessica, a 24-year-old who graduated college last year." Michael picked up her resume, holding it by the corner, as if it were contaminated. "You used to host galas that raised $2 million in a single night. You used to sign off on architectural blueprints for skyscrapers." "I need a job, Michael," she whispered, her hands clutching the strap of her handbag so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Why here?" Michael asked, his eyes narrowing. "Chicago is a big city. Why come to the man whose company you bankrupted?" Kendall looked down at the carpet. "Because you're the only one who knows I'm actually good at the work. Everyone else just knows the scandal." "The scandal," Michael repeated, tasting the word. "Is that what we're calling it? Not theft, not betrayal." "I made mistakes," she said, her voice trembling. "You destroyed a legacy." Michael stood up, then the sudden movement making her flinch. He walked to the window, turning his back to her. "I rebuilt this company from Ash Kendall, brick by brick, without you." "I know," she said softly to his back. "I read about the riverfront contract. It's magnificent." He turned around. He wanted to scream at her. He wanted to demand to know where the money went, where Chase was, why she looked so broken when she was supposed to be living the high life on his dime. But he saw her shoes. They were scuffed at the toe. She was desperate. She wasn't here to hurt him. She was here because she had nowhere else to go. A cruel, dark curiosity bloomed in his chest. He wanted to see this. He wanted to see the woman who had treated his heart like an ATM balance, Try to survive in the world she had forced him to inhabit. Kevin Walsh is my CFO now, Michael said coldly. You remember Kevin. You laughed at his cheap suits. Kendall closed her eyes. I remember. He will hate you. The board will whisper. I will not protect you. Michael leaned forward, his hands pressing into the desk. You start Monday, 8 a.m. sharp. If you are 1 minute late, don't bother coming in. Kendall looked up, shock replacing the fear. You're hiring me. I'm giving you a chance to earn a paycheck, Ms. Martin. Michael said, dismissing her with a wave of his hand. Don't make me regret it. She hesitated, looking like she wanted to say thank you or sorry, or perhaps scream. But she simply nodded, turned and walked out. As the door clicked shut, Michael sat back down. His heart was hammering against his ribs, a frantic, painful rhythm. He reached into his drawer and pulled out a small velvet box he had kept hidden for 5 years. Inside was a Patek Philippe watch, the one item he had bought for himself before the crash, the one thing she hadn't managed to steal. He stared at the ticking hands. The game had begun. 5 years earlier, the world had been golden. The crystal ballroom at the Palmer House. Hilton was suffocatingly warm, smelling of expensive perfume. Prime rib and old money. It was the annual Builders Association Gala, the night when Chicago's construction titans patted themselves on the back for reshaping the skyline. Kendall stood by the ice sculpture, a swan melting slowly under the chandeliers, clutching a flute of champagne that had gone warm 10 minutes ago. She was wearing a backless emerald gown that cost more than most people's cars. She looked perfect. She felt like a mannequin. Beside her, Michael was technically present, but his mind was 3 miles away at a construction site in the Loop. He had his phone pressed against his ear, his hand cupping the device to block out the jazz band. No, I told the foreman that concrete pour has to happen at 4 a.m. Michael barked into the phone, his brow furrowed. I don't care about the noise ordinance. Pay the fine. Just get the foundation set. Kendall touched his arm gently. Michael, the governor's looking over here. Michael didn't even blink. He turned his shoulders, slightly boxing her out. I have to take this, Kendall. It's the River North project. If we miss this window, we lose 2 weeks. He walked away. He walked away from her, from the governor, from the life they were supposed to be celebrating, and disappeared onto the balcony. Kendall stood alone in the center of the room, the smile plastered on her face beginning to ache. It was a familiar sting. She was the trophy, the ornament, the beautiful thing Michael had acquired to prove he had made it. But now that he had her, he didn't seem to know what to do with her, other than put her on a shelf. He's a fool, a voice said, smooth as velvet. Kendall turned. Standing there was a man she had seen only in the society pages, Chase Rivers. He was younger than Michael, with a shark-like grin and eyes that seemed to strip away the pretense of the room. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo. He was in a dark velvet blazer, defying the dress code with an arrogance that was magnetic. Excuse me, Kendall said, straightening her posture. Your husband, Chase, said, stepping into her personal space, just close enough to be improper, but not close enough to cause a scene. He leaves the most beautiful woman in Chicago alone next to a melting swan to talk about concrete. That's a fireable offense in my book. Kendall knew she should walk away. She knew Chase's reputation, a venture capitalist who burned through companies and women with equal indifference. But the attention felt like sunlight after a long winter. He's dedicated, Kendall defended weakly. He's building an empire. He's building a cage, Chase corrected, swirling his drink. Look at you. You're bored out of your mind. You want to dance, but he doesn't dance. You want to travel, but he can't leave the site. You're 26 years old, Kendall. Are you planning to spend the next 40 years holding his drink while he talks to foreman? The words struck a nerve she didn't know was exposed. She looked toward the balcony. Michael was still pacing, gesturing wildly at the empty air, completely oblivious to her existence. I'm happy, she lied. Chase laughed, a low, intimate sound. You're starving. I can see it in your eyes. He extended a hand. Let's dance. Just one song. Unless you need his permission. It was a challenge. It was a trap. Kendall looked at Michael one last time. He didn't turn around. He didn't check on her. He was married to the concrete. She set her glass down on the table with a sharp clink. One dance, she said. As Chase swept her onto the floor, His hand firm on the small of her back, the music seemed to swell. He didn't hold her like a trophy. He held her like he intended to consume her. For the first time in years, Kendall didn't feel like Michael Sullivan's wife. She felt like a dangerous secret waiting to happen. Across the room through the glass of the balcony doors, Michael finally hung up his phone. He looked back into the ballroom, scanning the crowd for the emerald dress. When he saw her laughing in the arms of another man, he felt a flicker of annoyance, but he checked his watch instead of intervening. He thought he had time. He thought she would always be there when he was done working. He was wrong. Monday morning at Sullivan Construction arrived with the subtle, grinding mechanical hum of a machine that never slept. For the 300 employees buzzing through the lobby, it was just another start to the week. For Kendall, it was a walk to the gallows. She stood in the elevator pressed into the back corner by a throng of junior analysts who smelled of espresso and ambition. None of them recognized her. To them, she was just the new temp, the woman in the outdated suit with the dark circles under her eyes. But as the doors chimed on the 12th floor, the administrative level, far below the executive suites, her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. This floor used to be storage. Now it was a sea of gray cubicles. "You're late," a voice snapped. Kendall checked the wall clock. "It's 7:55, Mr. Walsh. I'm 5 minutes early." Kevin Walsh, the CFO, leaned against the partition of the cubicle closest to the bathroom. He had aged in 5 years. His hairline had receded, and there was a hardness in his jaw that hadn't been there when he used to come over for Sunday dinners. Back then, he had been Michael's goofy college friend who laughed at her jokes. Now he looked at her as if she were a contagion he was forced to manage. "Early is on time. On time is late," Kevin said, his voice loud enough to turn heads. "This is your desk. You don't have a computer login yet because IT is dragging their feet? Or maybe they just don't trust you with the network. Can't imagine why." A few snickers rippled through the nearby desks. Kendall felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but she kept her chin down. "What would you like me to do?" Kevin dropped a heavy cardboard box onto the laminate desk with a thud that shook the cheap surface. Dust motes danced in the fluorescent light. "Archives," Kevin said. "Old invoices from the bankruptcy era. They're a mess. We need them digitized, but since you have no computer, you're going to organize them chronologically. By date, by vendor, by the cent." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a hiss. "You should be familiar with the numbers, Kendall. You spent enough of them." Kendall stared at the box. It was busy work. Punishment. "I'll get started," she said quietly. "And Kendall—" Kevin paused, already turning away. "The coffee in the break room is for full-time staff. There's a vending machine in the lobby if you get thirsty." He walked away, leaving her standing in the center of the hostile silence. Kendall sat down. Her chair squeaked. She opened the box, the smell of old paper and stale ink filling her nose, and began to sort. 30 floors above the air was rarefied and silent. Michael stood at the edge of his office, looking down through the glass floor section that offered a view of the atrium, but his attention was on the monitor screen on his desk. He had the security feed from the 12th floor pulled up. He watched the grainy black and white figure of his ex-wife hunch over the desk. He saw Kevin berate her. He saw the way her shoulders tensed, the way her hand went to her neck, a nervous tick she had always had when she was trying not to cry. Part of him, the dark, wounded part that had spent 5 years drinking alone in the dark, wanted to relish this. This was justice. This was the queen brought low, scrubbing the floors of the castle she burned down. But another part of him was unsettled. The Kendall he knew would have thrown the box at Kevin's head. She would have stormed out, called a lawyer, or manipulated someone else into doing the work. This woman simply put on her reading glasses and started working. She looked small, defeated. He zoomed in on the camera feed. She was working with a focus he had never seen her apply to anything other than a social calendar. She was organizing the very records of his financial ruin, the evidence of the collapse she caused, without flinching. "Sir," Michael snapped the monitor off as Jessica entered. "The board meeting is in 10 minutes, she said. "They want to discuss the Chase Rivers lawsuit." "Tell them I'm coming," Michael said. He stood up, buttoning his jacket. He glanced one last time at the blank screen where Kendall was serving her sentence. He had put her in a cage, expecting a tiger to lash out. Instead, he found a wounded dog that was just grateful for the shelter. And somehow that made him angrier than if she had fought back. Because if she was this broken, it meant Chase Rivers had done something far worse to her than Michael had ever imagined. The affair didn't start with a kiss. It started with a conversation, and then it evolved into a conspiracy. 4 months after the gala, the novelty of clandestine lunches had worn off, replaced by a desperate, feverish need that Kendall couldn't name. Chase Rivers didn't just sleep with her. He listened to her. He asked her about market trends, about the zoning laws she had studied in college, about the inner workings of Sullivan Construction. He made her feel like a partner, not a prop. But on a rainy Tuesday in November, the dynamic shifted. They were in Chase's penthouse overlooking the loop. The sheets were tangled at the foot of the bed, but the air in the room was brittle with tension. Chase was pacing a tumbler of scotch in his hand, looking agitated. "It's a liquidity issue, Kendall. That's all," Chase said, running a hand through his hair. "The deal is solid. It's a tech startup in Austin. They go public in 3 weeks, but I need to secure the equity buy-in by Friday, or I lose my position." Kendall sat on the edge of the bed, pulling the silk sheet around her body. "So call the bank, Chase. You have lines of credit." Frozen, he lied smoothly, turning to face her, with eyes that burned with intensity. "My assets are tied up in the chaotic merger of the Sterling account. It takes 10 days to unfreeze them. I only need the cash for 72 hours. 3 days, Kendall. Then I pay it back with 20% interest." He walked over to her, kneeling on the floor, so he was looking up at her. It was a pose of submission, but his grip on her knee was possessive. "I'm talking about $500,000, Chase," she whispered. "Chump change for Sullivan Construction," he countered. "I know Michael keeps a liquid reserve in the operating account for emergency material costs. I know he trusts you with the RSA tokens. You've told me he leaves them in the study." Kendall pulled back. "That's embezzlement." Chase's expression hardened just for a fraction of a second before melting back into desperation. "It's a loan, Kendall, a bridge loan. And think about it, Michael ignores you, he sidelines you. But if you made him $100,000 in interest in 3 days, you'd be showing him that you're a player, that you're smart." He kissed her palm. "Do you trust me?" The question hung in the air, heavy and toxic. If she said no, the fantasy ended. If she said no, she went back to being the lonely wife in the big empty house. "I trust you," she said. That night, the Sullivan mansion was quiet. Michael was in Detroit, meeting with steel suppliers. The house felt like a museum, pristine, cold, and echoing. Kendall walked into Michael's study. The smell of his cologne, cedar, and tobacco lingered in the air, a scent that used to make her feel safe. Now it made her feel like an intruder. She sat at his massive oak desk. The computer hummed to life. She knew the passwords. She knew the security protocols. Michael had never hidden anything from her, because the concept of her betraying him was as foreign to him as the sky falling. He had given her the keys to the kingdom because he thought she was the queen. She opened the banking portal. The balance stared back at her. Operational reserve $2,400,000. Her hands shook as she typed in the routing number for an offshore LLC Chase had given her. $500,000. Her finger hovered over the transfer button. Her heart was beating so hard she could hear the blood rushing in her ears, a deafening roar of warning. "Don't do it. This is the point of no return." But then she remembered Chase's voice. "You're smart. You're a player." She wanted to be more than a wife. She wanted to be significant. She clicked the mouse. Transfer complete. The screen blinked, indifferent to the catastrophe it had just recorded. A wave of nausea rolled over her, followed immediately by a jolt of electric adrenaline. She had done it. She had moved the world. She didn't know then that the money wouldn't be back in 3 days. She didn't know this was the first of a dozen transfers that would bleed the company dry. She only knew that for the first time in years, her heart was racing, and the silence of the house didn't feel so empty anymore. It was filled with the deafening noise of her own secret. The crisis hit Sullivan Construction at 10 a.m. on a Wednesday, shattering the fragile quiet of the executive floor. The riverfront project, a $200 million mixed-use development that was supposed to be Michael's crowning achievement, had been red-tagged by the city inspector. Construction was halted. Every hour the cranes stood still cost the company $10,000. The main conference room was a chaotic sea of shouting voices, crumpled paper, and the sharp scent of nervous sweat. The lead architect, a man named Sterling with thick glasses and a thin patience, was slamming his hand on the table. "It's a zoning error," Sterling yelled. "The city changed the setback requirements for riparian zones last month. We're 3 feet over the line. We have to redesign the entire plaza foundation. That sets us back 6 months." Michael stood at the head of the table, his face a mask of controlled fury. He was staring at the blueprints spread out like a war map. "We don't have 6 months. If we miss the spring opening, the investors walk. Fix it." "I can't move the river, Michael," Sterling shot back. In the corner of the room, Kendall was invisible. She had been summoned to bring coffee and clear away the lunch debris. She moved silently around the perimeter of the heated argument, clutching a tray of empty sandwich wrappers. She wasn't supposed to be listening. She wasn't supposed to understand the jargon flying through the air. But she did. She looked at the projected map on the wall. She studied the red line where the inspector had marked the violation. Her eyes narrowed. She remembered this. Not this specific project, but this specific plot of land. 5 years ago, during the happier times, she had taken a deep dive into Chicago's historical zoning archives just to have something to talk to Michael about at dinner. She hesitated. Her job was to take the trash out. Speaking up was suicide. Kevin Walsh was sitting to Michael's right, looking ready to fire someone. "Let it burn," a voice inside her whispered. "Let him fail like you failed." But she looked at Michael. He looked exhausted. The Titan was cracking. And despite everything, the theft, the betrayal, the silence, she couldn't stand to watch him lose. "It's not a riparian zone issue," Kendall said. The voice was soft, but it cut through the shouting match like a razor. The room went dead silent. 12 heads turned to look at the woman holding the trash tray. Kevin Walsh sneered. "Excuse me, Ms. Martin, empty the bins and get out. The adults are talking." "Wait," Michael said. His voice was low, dangerous. He looked at Kendall, his eyes locking onto hers. "What did you say?" Kendall set the tray down on a side table. Her hands were shaking, but she clasped them behind her back to hide it. She walked toward the blueprint, ignoring Kevin's scoff. "The inspector is citing the 2020 riparian ordinance," she said, her voice gaining strength. She pointed to a jagged line on the map. "But this plot of land, the old shipyard, was designated an industrial heritage site in 1988. It has a grandfather clause regarding the waterline setbacks." Sterling rolled his eyes. "That designation expired 10 years ago." "It didn't," Kendall countered. "It renews automatically unless the city council votes to revoke it." They never did. "I read the minutes from the 2014 council meeting. If you file for an exemption under the heritage clause, the setback requirement drops from 50 feet to 20 feet. You're not 3 feet over. You're 27 feet under." Silence stretched tight across the room. Sterling blinked, pulling out his tablet and furiously tapping away. That can't be right. No one uses the heritage clause anymore." "Check the addendum to Title 17, Kendall said, reciting the code from memory. "Section 4, paragraph B." Michael watched her. For a moment, the years melted away. He wasn't looking at his disgraced ex-wife. He was looking at the woman who used to proofread his contracts at midnight, the woman whose sharp intellect he had once bragged about. He saw the spark in her eyes, the competence that had been buried under layers of guilt and shame. "Found it," Sterling whispered, his face paling. "Holy hell, she's right. Title 17, Section 4. The exemption is still active." The air in the room shifted instantly. The panic evaporated, replaced by the frantic energy of a solution found. "Get legal on the phone," Michael commanded, not taking his eyes off Kendall. "File the exemption immediately. Get the inspector back out there by noon." "On it," Kevin said, scrambling for his phone, though he shot Kendall a look of pure venom before turning away. Kendall stepped back, the adrenaline fading, leaving her feeling exposed and out of place. She picked up her tray. I'll get the rest of the coffee cups." "Leave them," Michael said. He walked over to where she stood. The table separated them, but the distance felt short for the first time. "You saved the project," he said. It wasn't a thank you. It was a statement of fact. "I just remembered something I read," Kendall murmured, looking at her shoes. "You didn't just remember. You understood," Michael corrected. He looked at her, really looked at her, searching for the deceit he expected to find, but seeing only a desperate desire to be useful. Why didn't you use that brain to stop yourself from robbing me? The question was a slap in the face. The warmth of the professional victory vanished, replaced by the cold reality of their history. I don't know, Kendall whispered. Go back to the 12th floor, Kendall, Michael said, his voice hardening again. Jessica will handle the cleanup. Kendall nodded and fled the room. But as she waited for the elevator, her heart wasn't heavy with shame. It was beating with a strange new rhythm. For 5 minutes she hadn't been a thief. She had been part of the team. And she saw the way Michael had looked at her, not with hatred, but with respect. It was a dangerous drug, and she was terrified she was already addicted to it again. The truth didn't come with a bang. It came in the form of a decimal point that was 3 places to the left of where it should have been. It was 3 months after Kendall's first transfer. The winter of 5 years ago was particularly brutal, burying Chicago in snowdrifts that froze construction sites solid. Michael was in his study, the only light coming from the green glow of his banker's lamp. He was reviewing the quarterly projections for the Sullivan Group. He took a sip of whiskey, the ice clinking softly against the glass, and frowned. The operational reserve account was showing a balance of $1.2 million. That was impossible. Last week it had been $1.9 million. Michael rubbed his eyes, assuming he was tired. He refreshed the page. The number remained stubbornly low. He pulled up the transaction history, expecting to see a large payment for steel or a retainer for the union lawyers. Instead, he saw a series of wire transfers. November 14th, $150,000 to CR Ventures, LLC. December 2nd, $200,000 to CR Ventures, LLC. January 10th, $350,000 to CR Ventures, LLC. CR Ventures. The name meant nothing to him. Michael sat back, the leather chair groaning under his weight. He didn't call the bank immediately. He didn't wake Kendall, who was sleeping in the master bedroom down the hall. A cold, predatory stillness took over him. He was a builder. He understood that before you tear down a wall, you have to know what it's supporting. He opened a new tab and logged into his LexisNexis account, a tool he used to vet subcontractors. He ran a search on CR Ventures, LLC. The registered agent was a lawyer in Delaware. A dead end. But the beneficiary address on the incorporation papers pointed to a P.O. box in the Cayman Islands, and the co-signer for the initial filing, Chase Rivers. Michael stopped breathing. He knew the name. Chase Rivers was the flash-in-the-pan venture capitalist who had been photographed at the same parties Kendall attended. The man with the smile that looked like a weapon. Michael closed his eyes. The pieces clicked together with the sickening precision of a loaded gun. The late nights Kendall spent with friends. The new lingerie he found in the laundry but never saw her wear. The distance in her eyes. She was sleeping with him, and she was paying him with Michael's money. Rage, white-hot and blinding, surged through him. He reached for the phone to call the police. This was grand larceny. He could have her in handcuffs by sunrise. He could destroy Chase Rivers before breakfast. But his hand hovered over the receiver. Something didn't add up. Chase Rivers was supposed to be rich. Why would a multimillionaire need to steal a few $100,000 from a construction company? It was petty cash to a guy like that. Michael put the phone down. He picked up his personal cell and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. Baker, a voice answered on the second ring. It's 2:00 a.m., Sullivan. I need a deep dive, Frank. Michael said, his voice devoid of emotion. Chase Rivers, Financials Debts Associates. I don't care about his portfolio. I want to know who is holding his leash. I need it in an hour. 45 minutes later, an email pinged into Michael's inbox. The report was short but devastating. Chase Rivers wasn't a tycoon. He was a fraud. He was leveraged to the hilt, bleeding cash into underground poker rings and bad crypto bets. But the kicker was the list of his creditors. One name stood out, the Vargas Syndicate. Eastern European loan sharks who didn't sue for non-payment. They broke kneecaps. Michael stared at the screen. Chase Rivers was a dead man walking. He owed the Vargas $2 million. He was using Kendall as his piggy bank to keep the wolves at bay. And Kendall. She probably thought she was investing. She probably thought she was the savvy partner helping her brilliant lover through a liquidity crunch. She had no idea she was feeding a gambling addict who would drag her down with him. Michael stood up and walked to the window. He looked out at the snowy lawn. If he stopped the transfers, the Vargas would come for Chase. And if Kendall was with Chase when they came, she would be collateral damage. He hated her in that moment. He hated her for her stupidity, for her betrayal, for the ease with which she gutted their life together. But he loved her more than he hated her. He walked back to the computer. He looked at the bank balance. There was enough left to keep the company afloat for maybe 2 more months if he cut all executive salaries, including his own. He made a decision that would haunt him for the next 5 years. He didn't freeze the account. He didn't change the passwords. "Take it," he whispered to the empty room. "Take it all." He would let her drain the company. He would let the empire collapse. Because if the money stopped, she might get hurt. He would sacrifice his legacy to buy her safety, even if she never knew he was the one paying the bill. He turned off the lamp and sat in the dark, listening to the silence of his house, waiting for the ruin to come. The blizzard hit Chicago with the force of a divine judgment. By 8 p.m., the city was a blur of white static, the streets below the Sullivan Tower erased by swirling snow. The rest of the staff had gone home hours ago, fleeing before the roads became impassable. On the 42nd floor, the lights were dimmed to a low amber hum. Michael sat at the head of the conference table, his tie loosened, sleeves rolled up to his elbows. Spread out before him were the revised zoning applications for the riverfront project. Across from him, Kendall was typing furiously on a laptop Kevin had finally begrudgingly assigned to her. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic clicking of keys and the howl of the wind against the reinforced glass. It felt dangerously familiar. 10 years ago, before the money, before the mansion, before Chase Rivers, this was how they had built the first company. Late nights, cheap takeout, and a shared manic drive to succeed. Back then, they would have been laughing. They would have been sharing a carton of pad thai, their knees touching under the table. Now the distance between them was measured in light years, though they were only 4 feet apart. "I've cross-referenced the Heritage Addendum with the state environmental codes." Kendall said, her voice raspy from hours of silence. She didn't look up. "We need to file 3 separate affidavits by morning to beat the injunction." "Print them," Michael said, not looking up either. "I'll sign." Kendall hit print. The machine in the corner whirred to life. She stood up to retrieve the papers, but as she walked past the window, she paused. The view was hypnotic, a white abyss. "Do you remember the blizzard of 18? She asked softly. The words hung in the air, unauthorized and fragile. Michael's pen stopped moving. He didn't want to remember. In 2018, they had been snowed in at their first apartment. They had lost power. They had spent 2 days wrapped in blankets drinking wine and planning the names of their future children. Children that never happened. "Ms. Martin." Michael warned, his voice low. Kendall turned to face him. The fatigue on her face stripped away her defenses. She looked raw. I wanted to say that I'm grateful. For this job, I know you didn't have to." "It wasn't charity," Michael said, returning his attention to the papers, though he wasn't reading a single word. "You were the cheapest qualified candidate." "I know," she whispered. She took a step closer to the table. "But I also know what I did. I know I don't deserve to be in this room." Michael slowly looked up. The amber light caught the hollows of her cheeks. She wasn't the monster he had constructed in his mind for 5 years. She was just a person who had made a catastrophic series of choices. "Why did you come back, Kendall?" he asked. It was the question that had been burning a hole in his gut since she walked into his office. "Chase is gone. The money is gone. Why come back to the scene of the crime?" Kendall gripped the back of the leather chair. "Because when I was with him, when I had everything I thought I wanted, I realized I had left the only thing that was real." Her voice cracked. "I came back because I wanted to see if there was anything left standing, or if I really had burned it all to the ground." The air in the room grew thin. Michael felt a pull in his chest, a dangerous magnetic urge to stand up, to walk around the table, to ask her the million questions that kept him awake at night. "Did you love him? Did you laugh at me? Do you miss me?" For a second, the anger wavered. He saw her hand resting on the leather, the same hand he had held at their wedding. But then he looked at his wrist, the Patek Philippe, the symbol of what he had kept and what she had taken. The memory of the bank statements, the red ink, the humiliation of the bankruptcy hearing flashed before his eyes. He couldn't let her in. Not again. Michael stood up abruptly, the chair scraping, loud and harsh, against the floor. "The affidavits, Ms. Martin," he said, his voice cold as the ice on the window. "Bring them to my desk. Then you can sleep on the couch in the reception area. The roads are closed and I don't pay for hotel rooms for staff." Kendall flinched as if he had slapped her. The vulnerability vanished, replaced by the dull mask of the employee. "Yes, sir," she whispered. Michael grabbed his jacket and walked into his private office, slamming the door shut. He leaned back against the heavy wood, breathing hard, his heart racing. He was the king of the castle, the master of the universe. But standing there in the dark, listening to his ex-wife weep softly in the next room, he had never felt more like a prisoner. The end of the marriage did not happen with a scream or a thrown vase or a lawyer serving papers in a crowded restaurant. It happened on a Tuesday morning in May under a sky so blue it felt mocking. 5 years ago, the house was silent. It was 10 a.m. Michael was supposed to be at the West Loop site supervising the pouring of the foundation for a new luxury high-rise. Kendall knew his schedule. She knew she had exactly 2 hours before he would even check his phone for messages. She moved through the master bedroom like a ghost pulling clothes from the walk-in closet. Not everything, just the essentials. Silk blouses, cashmere sweaters, the jewelry he had bought her for their anniversaries. She stuffed them into 2 Louis Vuitton suitcases, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. Her heart was beating in her throat, a frantic hummingbird rhythm. Chase was waiting 3 blocks away in a rented sedan. "Just get the bags, Kendall," he had told her, his voice tight with a fear she mistook for excitement. "We have to be at O'Hare by noon. The flight to Rio leaves at 1. She paused at the vanity. She picked up a framed photo of her and Michael from their honeymoon in intricate silver framing. They looked so young, so unburdened. A wave of nausea rolled over her. She placed the photo face down on the marble surface. She couldn't take it. She couldn't take the memory of the man she was bankrupting. She walked to the kitchen island to write the letter. This was the part Chase had insisted on. "You have to leave a note, Kendall. Make it clean. Tell him you fell out of love. Don't mention the money. Don't mention me. Just cut the cord." She pulled a piece of heavy cream stationery from the drawer. Her hand shook so violently the pen skidded across the paper. "Michael," she wrote, "I can't do this anymore. The loneliness is too much. I'm sorry. Please don't look for me. It was a lie." It was a pathetic, cowardly lie designed to cover up the fact that she had wired the last $300,000 of the company's operating capital to a shell account in the Caymans 4 hours ago. She left the note on the granite counter, anchored by his coffee mug. She grabbed the handles of her suitcases, the wheels humming softly over the hardwood floors, as she headed for the front door. She felt like a fugitive. She felt like she was escaping a prison, not realizing she was running directly into a burning building. She didn't look back. She opened the heavy oak door, stepped out into the blinding sunlight, and closed it behind her. The click of the latch was the loudest sound she had ever heard. She was gone, but she wasn't alone. At the top of the grand staircase, standing deep in the shadows of the landing where the sunlight didn't reach, Michael Sullivan stood perfectly still. He hadn't gone to the site. He had been there the whole time. He had watched her pack. He had watched her turn the photo face down. He had watched her write the note, struggling for words that would justify the unjustifiable. In his right hand, he didn't hold a weapon. He held a stack of stapled papers, the bank statements from that morning. The balance read $0. He could have walked down the stairs. He could have blocked the door. He could have thrown the papers in her face and screamed until the window shattered. He could have called the police and had her arrested before she reached the sidewalk. But he didn't move. He thought about the report on Chase Rivers. He thought about the Vargas syndicate and the men who broke kneecaps for sport. He knew that the money was already gone lost to Chase's debts. If he kept Kendall here, if he forced her to face the truth now, the violence that was hunting Chase would come to their doorstep. She was leaving with the man who had ruined them, thinking she was running toward freedom. Michael knew she was running into a trap, but it was a trap he couldn't protect her from anymore. She had made her choice. He looked at the empty foyer. He looked at the note on the counter, a white square of betrayal in the center of his home. He let out a breath he felt he had been holding for months. His knees gave way, and he sat down on the top step, the papers slipping from his hand and scattering across the floor like dead leaves. "Goodbye, Kendall." he whispered to the silence. He stayed there until the sun went down, watching the light fade across the floor, waiting for the phone to ring, waiting for the bank to call, waiting for his life to officially end. The Chicago spring was wet and gray, a season of mud rather than rebirth. It was 6 p.m. on a Friday, and the lobby of the Sullivan Tower was a steady stream of umbrellas and trench coats moving toward the revolving doors. Kendall adjusted her scarf, keeping her head down. She had been working at the company for 6 weeks. The hostility from the staff had dulled into a passive indifference, which she preferred. She was a ghost in the machine, filing papers, answering phones, and trying to make herself invisible. She pushed through the revolving door, stepping out into the wet pavement of Wacker Drive. The cold air bit at her face. "Hello, darling." The voice came from the shadows of a concrete pillar, slick with oil and rain. It was a voice that used to make her heart skip a beat. Now it made her stomach turn over. Kendall froze. She turned slowly. Chase Rivers stepped into the light of the street lamp. Time had not been kind to him. The man who had worn Italian silk suits and charmed his way into Chicago's elite was gone. In his place was a specter. His coat was stained, his hair was thinning and unkempt, and his eyes were rimmed with red, darting nervously around the street. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in a week. He looked like a man who was being hunted. "Chase," Kendall breathed, stepping back. "What are you doing here?" "I've been watching you," Chase said, a jagged smile cutting across his face. He moved closer, the smell of stale bourbon and old sweat radiating from him. "You're back with him. I saw you walk in. I saw your key card. Sullivan Construction. Cozy." "I work there, Chase. I'm an assistant," Kendall said, clutching her purse to her chest. "I have nothing to do with Michael." Chase laughed, a harsh barking sound that made a passerby glance over. "Don't lie to me. You're inside. You have access, which means you can help me." "Help you?" Kendall's voice rose in disbelief. "You left me in Rio with a maxed-out credit card and a fake passport. You left me to rot." "I had to move." Chase snapped, his desperation flaring into aggression. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into the wool of her coat. "The Vargas found me, Kendall. They're in Chicago. They want their money. 200 grand. That's the interest. I need it by Monday." "I don't have money," Kendall cried, trying to pull away. "I make $15 an hour." "But Sullivan has it," Chase hissed, pulling her closer, his face inches from hers. "You get him to pay. You tell him to cut a check, or I start releasing things. I kept everything, Kendall. The emails you wrote about how boring he was, the videos from the hotel room in Cabo. I'll send them to the board. I'll send them to the press. I'll ruin his precious reputation and shame you out of this city forever." Kendall felt the blood drain from her face. The videos, the private, intimate moments she had thought were expressions of love, now weaponized as leverage. "You wouldn't," she whispered. "I'm a dead man walking, Kendall." Chase said, his eyes wild. "I'll burn everyone down if I don't get that money." Suddenly, the revolving doors of the tower hissed open. Michael Sullivan stepped out. He was flanked by 2 security guards, but he waved them back. He stood at the top of the stairs, an imposing silhouette against the warm light of the lobby. He was wearing a long black overcoat, looking every inch the titan of industry he had become. He didn't yell. He didn't run. He simply stood there, his gaze locking onto Chase Rivers with the cold detachment of an executioner. Chase froze. His grip on Kendall's arm loosened slightly. "Let her go," Michael said. The voice wasn't loud, but it carried over the sound of the traffic, deep and resonant. Chase sneered, trying to summon his old arrogance, but his hands were shaking. "Well, well, the cuckold husband to the rescue. Did you miss us, Michael?" Michael walked down the stairs one step at a time. He didn't look at Kendall. He looked only at Chase. "I said," Michael repeated, stopping 3 feet away, "let my employee go." Chase shoved Kendall aside. She stumbled, catching herself against the wet concrete pillar. Chase straightened his jacket, trying to look tall. "We were just catching up, Mike. Discussing a business transaction. Kendall here owes me a severance package." Michael's expression didn't change. He reached into his coat pocket. Chase flinched, expecting a gun, but Michael pulled out a sleek black cell phone. "The police are 3 minutes away," Michael said calmly. "And the Varga brothers, My sources tell me they're currently looking for a gray sedan with Illinois plates. The one parked around the corner. Chase's face went white. You spoke to them. I speak to everyone, Michael said. Get in your car, Chase, run. Because if you're still on my sidewalk in 30 seconds, I won't need the police. Chase looked from Michael to Kendall, realized he had no leverage, no power, and no time. He spat on the ground near Michael's expensive shoes, turned and sprinted toward the corner. Kendall stood trembling in the rain, the adrenaline crashing out of her system. She looked at Michael, waiting for him to yell, to blame her, to fire her for bringing this filth to his doorstep. Michael looked at her. Raindrops clung to his eyelashes. Go inside, Miss Martin, he said quietly. You'll catch a cold. Then he turned and walked toward his waiting limousine, leaving her safe but utterly alone. An hour after the incident on the sidewalk, the city of Chicago was dark, settling into the wet, cold quiet of a rainy night. But inside the Blue Moon Bar, a dive near the Greyhound bus station, the air was thick with the smell of stale beer and desperation. Chase Rivers sat in a corner booth nursing a cheap whiskey, his eyes darting toward the door every time it opened. He was shaking. He had played his last card on the sidewalk, and Michael Sullivan had trumped it effortlessly. The door opened again. The wind howled briefly before the heavy wood slammed shut. Michael didn't look out of place in the dive bar. He looked like he owned it. He walked straight to the booth, his long coat damp from the rain, and slid into the seat opposite Chase. He placed a single thick manila envelope on the sticky table. Chase stared at the envelope. Is that it? $200,000, Michael said. His voice was flat, devoid of anger or judgment. It was the voice of a man closing a business deal. Cash. Untraceable. Chase reached for the envelope, his fingers trembling with greed. He tore the corner open, checking the bills. A manic grin spread across his face. I knew you were soft, Sullivan. I knew you'd pay to keep your little ex-wife's reputation clean. You still love her, don't you, pathetic? Michael didn't blink. He signaled the bartender for a water. I'm not paying for her reputation, Chase. I'm paying for her freedom. Same difference, Chase scoffed, stuffing the envelope into his jacket. You think this makes you a hero? You're just the bank. You've always been just the bank. Perhaps, Michael conceded. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. But banks have terms, and here are mine. He pulled a second item from his pocket, a one-way bus ticket to Omaha. You are going to take the 10 p.m. bus? Michael said. You are going to get off in Omaha. You are never coming back to Chicago. If you do, I won't call the police. I'll call the Varga brothers and tell them exactly where to find the man who tried to skip town on a $2 million debt. Chase's smile faltered. You know about the total? I bought your debt note an hour ago, Michael revealed quietly. Technically, you don't owe the Vargas anymore. You owe me. The color drained from Chase's face completely. He looked at the cash in his jacket, then at Michael. The dynamic had shifted tectonically. Michael wasn't paying blackmail. He was granting a pardon. Why? Chase whispered. Why help me? I took your wife. I took your company. Michael looked at the man who had haunted his nightmares for 5 years. He looked for the charm, the brilliance, the fire that had seduced Kendall. He found none of it. He saw only a small, scared grifter. Because as long as you are here, she will never forgive herself, Michael said. And I need her to focus on her work. Michael held out his hand. The phone, Chase, and the backups. Chase hesitated for a fraction of a second, then reached into his pocket. He pulled out a smartphone and a USB drive. He placed them on the table. Michael took them. He didn't look at the device. He didn't check the gallery. He simply dropped them into his glass of water. The screen fizzled and went black. Go, Michael said. Chase scrambled out of the booth, clutching his cash, and ran toward the door without looking back. He was a rich man for a few weeks, but he was a ghost forever. Michael sat alone in the booth. He watched the bubbles rise from the drowning phone. He thought about the videos, the messages, the intimate history of his wife's betrayal locked inside that device. He could have watched them. He could have tortured himself with the details of their affair. Instead, he signaled the bartender. Check, please, Michael said. He paid the bill, left a generous tip, and walked out into the rain. The transaction was complete. The ledger was balanced. He had spent $2 million to buy a bad debt and $200,000 to banish a nuisance. It was a terrible return on investment financially speaking. But as he stepped into the cool night air, Michael felt a weight lift off his shoulders that had been crushing him for half a decade. He wasn't the victim anymore. He was the one who decided how the story ended. The morning after Chase Rivers disappeared from Chicago, the silence in Michael's office was deafening. The storm had passed, leaving the city scoured clean and bright under a hard blue sky. Kendall stood in front of Michael's desk. She looked exhausted, her eyes rimmed with red, her hands twisting a paperclip until the metal snapped. She had heard the rumors Chase had been seen boarding a greyhound, looking like a whipped dog. She knew who was responsible. "You paid him," Kendall said. It wasn't a question. Michael didn't look up from his monitor. He was reviewing the final compliance report for the riverfront project. "He won't bother you again." "Why?" Kendall's voice cracked. She took a step forward, her professional mask crumbling. "Why would you do that after everything I did? I stole from you, Michael. I drained your accounts. I left you with nothing but debt and humiliation, and you pay off my blackmailer." Michael stopped typing. He slowly swiveled his chair to face her. His expression was unreadable, a wall of stone that had been built over 5 years of solitude. "You think you stole from me?" Michael asked softly. "I know I did." Kendall insisted, tears spilling over. "I logged in. I used the tokens. I transferred the money to the Caymans. I thought I was so clever. I thought you were too busy looking at blueprints to notice your wife was robbing you blind." Michael stood up. He walked over to a small safe concealed behind a panel in the wall. He spun the dial left, right, left, and pulled out a single leather-bound notebook. He tossed it onto the desk between them. "Open it," he commanded. Kendall hesitated, then reached out. Her trembling fingers opened the book. It wasn't a diary. It was a manual log of transaction codes. November 14th, 2018. Transfer authorized $150,000. Destination CR Ventures. Notes Chase Rivers / Varga Syndicate debt. December 2nd, 2018. Transfer authorized $200,000. Notes interest payment to Varga. Kendall froze. The blood drained from her face, leaving her ghostly pale. She looked at the dates. She looked at the notes in Michael's handwriting. You knew," she whispered. "You knew about the transfers. I knew before the money left the bank." Michael said, his voice heavy with a terrible fatigue. "I got the alert on the first one. I investigated Chase. I found out he owed $2 million to the Varga crime family. I knew that if he didn't pay them, they wouldn't just hurt him. They would hurt anyone close to him." Kendall stared at him, her mouth opening, but no sound coming out. The world was tilting on its axis. "I had a choice." Michael continued walking around the desk until he was standing right in front of her. "I could have frozen the accounts. I could have had you arrested. I could have saved the company. But you didn't," Kendall breathed. "No," Michael said, "because if I cut off the money, the Vargas would have come for Chase. And you were with Chase. You were sleeping in his bed. You were riding in his car." He looked down at her, his eyes dark with the memory of that impossible choice. "So I let you take it. I authorized every single transfer from my end so the security system wouldn't lock you out. I watched you bleed the company dry dollar by dollar because it was the only way to keep the wolves away from you." Kendall dropped the notebook. It hit the floor with a dull thud. She fell to her knees, overcome by the crushing weight of the revelation. All these years she had carried the guilt of being the cunning thief who outsmarted her husband. But she hadn't outsmarted him. He had watched her stab him, and he had guided the knife so it wouldn't hurt her when it recoiled. "You bankrupt yourself," she sobbed, clutching her chest. "You lost the house. You lost your reputation. You almost went to jail for insolvency. For me, I can rebuild a company, Kendall." Michael said, his voice devoid of warmth, stating a cold, hard fact. "I can't rebuild a person." He didn't reach down to comfort her. He didn't offer a hand to help her up. He simply stood there, the architect of his own destruction, watching the woman he had saved finally understand the price of her safety. "I thought you were a fool." Kendall wept, her forehead pressing against the carpet. "I thought you were blind." "I was never blind," Michael replied, turning back to the window to look out at the city he had conquered twice. "I just loved you more than I loved my pride, and that was my mistake." not yours. 2 days later, they met at the Sunrise Cafe. It was a small, unassuming place near the river, the kind with checkered floors and waitresses who called everyone honey. It was also the place where 8 years ago, Michael had asked Kendall to marry him. The choice of venue was deliberate. Michael wanted to end it where it began. Kendall was already there, sitting in a booth by the window. She looked different. The fear that had defined her posture for the last few months was gone, replaced by a somber, heavy clarity. She wore her hair down, and for the first time since her return, she looked like herself, not the trophy wife, not the desperate applicant, but a woman who had survived a storm. Michael slid into the booth opposite her. He didn't order coffee. "I finished the archives," Kendall said quietly. "Every invoice is digitized. The system is up to date." "I know," Michael said. "Jessica told me." "Good work." He reached into his inner jacket pocket and placed a thick, cream-colored envelope on the table. It wasn't money. It wasn't a subpoena. Kendall looked at it, then up at him. "What is this?" "A letter of recommendation," Michael answered, "addressed to the CEO of Sterling Development in New York. They're looking for a project coordinator. I told them you have an intuitive grasp of zoning laws that rivals most senior architects. I told them you're the reason the riverfront project is moving forward." Kendall didn't reach for the envelope. Her hands were clenched in her lap. "You're firing me." "I'm letting you go," Michael corrected gently. "There's a difference. I can stay," she pleaded, her voice trembling slightly. "I can work off the debt. I can be better. Michael, knowing what you did for me, knowing that you sacrificed everything just to keep me safe, how can I walk away from that? How can I walk away from you?" Michael looked out the window. The city was moving traffic, flowing in a ceaseless river of steel and light. He felt a deep, dull ache in his chest, the ghost of the love he had once held so fiercely. It would have been easy to say yes. It would have been easy to let her stay, to let gratitude morph into a new kind of relationship. But it would be a relationship built on ashes. "You can't stay, Kendall," Michael said, turning his gaze back to her. "Because every time you look at me, you'll see the man you betrayed. And every time I look at you, I'll see the woman who cost me 5 years of my life. We can fix it," she whispered. "No," Michael said. His voice was final, solid as the concrete he built his empire with. "Trust is like a mirror. You can fix it if it breaks, but you can still see the crack in the reflection. I have forgiven you, Kendall. Truly, I don't hate you anymore. But I can't build a future with you." He pushed the envelope closer to her. "New York is a good city for second chances. Go there. Be the woman I knew you could be. Not for Chase, not for me, for yourself." Kendall stared at the envelope for a long time. A tear slipped down her cheek, but she brushed it away. She understood. He was giving her the one thing she hadn't had in 5 years: dignity. She reached out and took the letter. She stood up, clutching it to her chest like a shield. "Thank you, Michael," she said. Her voice was steady. "For saving me, twice." "Goodbye, Kendall," Michael said. She turned and walked out of the cafe. The bell above the door chimed a bright, cheerful sound that marked the end of an era. Michael watched her through the glass as she hailed a cab, stepped inside, and disappeared into the traffic of the morning rush. He sat alone in the booth for a moment. The silence around him was no longer heavy. It was peaceful. Michael stood up and adjusted his coat. He walked out onto the sidewalk, the cold wind off the river hitting his face sharp and cleansing. He rolled back his cuff and looked at the Patek Philippe on his wrist. The gears were turning perfectly, measuring seconds, minutes, hours. It was 9 o'clock a.m. The market was opening. The cranes were moving. He had a company to run. He looked at the empty space where the cab had been, then turned toward his tower. "Some bridges aren't meant to be rebuilt, Kendall," he murmured to the wind. "They're just meant to remind us that we can cross over to the other side."